What's up guys, today in this video we are going to look at how we can protect our routes inside the NestJS application using JWT. So far in our application we haven't used any kind of authentication, and hence if you see, even the quiz controller has the get routes and even the creation of a quiz without any kind of authentication. So let's see how we can use the JWT token strategy along with Passport to safeguard our APIs. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is to install a few packages and create a strategy called local strategy. Inside Nest, we have strategies which define how we are going to use Passport inside the application. Okay, if you are not aware of Passport, Passport is one of the most popular ways of implementing authentication. So let me open up the Passport documentation and I'll show you a little bit of it. Oops, not the Passport government. Maybe I'll do Passport node. So there are different kinds of strategies available with Passport, and it is more than just a module. I will say it's almost like, a flexible framework which allows you to have login based on multiple strategies, and there are so many. Okay, 537 strategies to start with. You have HTTP bearer, Facebook, Google Auth, Twitter, whatnot. If we look at Facebook, for example, there are certain things like we configure our Passport strategy with certain kinds of configurations, and then we use it for our authentication. Now, what NestJS does is it has created a small wrapper on top of Passport so that the overall experience which we get is quite easy to start with. Okay, so let's get started and see how we implement it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is install a few dependencies, the NestJS Passport and Passport local. Once these packages are installed, I'll also install their type definitions because that is important for us to work with. Okay, so with these dependencies installed and out of the picture, let's now create a few stuff so that we can start working with our application. The first thing which I'm going to generate is inside modules folder, a module called Auth. What this will basically do is, if I go to my code inside source modules, I have a new folder called Auth. Inside that I have Auth module. And what Nest also does is inside main.ts, no, sorry, not the main.ts, app module, it imports that. So certain things are taken care of. Okay, so now this is done. I also need a service. Let's see if I can do no spec. What it will do is it will not create the test file because I'm not writing any tests right now, but now I have a service file, and this would have automatically added that as a part of provider. Okay, so this is done, and the last thing which I would like to do is create a controller. Okay, with these things in place, now we can actually look at how we can have our login controller, or rather the auth controller, handle the login part of the application. So in here, let's just say we have a post route called login, and we will handle whatever is the logic behind this. Now, how do we indicate the application that when a request is coming to this URL, it will need to validate whatever is coming and see whether the credentials match or not, right? So for that, what we typically do is first we will create something called as guards. Okay, a guard is, you can consider that as some kind of a middleware. It intercepts the request, and if it finds that there are certain kinds of available guards to it, which we have mentioned, which we will mention, then it will execute it first. So what we will do over here is, first of all, create a guard. We will name it local auth.guard.ts, and this is only going to define what is the strategy that we are going to use. Okay, so export class like so. And how do we know what is the name of that guard? Let's go to this Passport documentation, and we have Passport local. If you open up the documentation over here, can you see specify this as the strategy? So that is how we know which strategy has what naming convention. So this is done. And now what I can do is do use guards, local auth guard, And because we are injecting it, I think I need to add the injectable property to it. Okay, it's a decorator, sorry. So with this in place, I think our app is still working and we haven't done anything as of now, which can result in any difference in application's code behavior, sorry. But what is going to happen is this passport strategy or guard, right? When it gets executed, it will try to validate. And if it finds correct credentials, it will add the user object in the request. How do we do that? So if we do something like request, and it's going to return a promise of type any for now. And what I'm saying is if the guard validates, right? If this guard is successful in validating, right, it will return a user object in the request. That's what typically any passport strategy will do. But then we haven't created a strategy as of now, right? So how do we do that? So let's create the strategy first. So we will create a file called local strategy.ts. Now this is going to extend passport strategy. So I'll quickly boilerplate that code. Okay, this is going to be the class, and inside passport strategy, I need to send what strategy I'm going to use. So in this case, we are going to use the local strategy. So I can type hint passport local as the strategy. Now this is again going to be an injectable thing. So I'll just add the decorator over here. And additionally, because we are going to inject it, maybe we will add that as part of the provider as well. So local strategy. This is important. Otherwise, we may have some issues with our code. Okay, it will kind of complain about certain dependencies which are not being met. Now let's go back to our strategy. We'll need to define the constructor, and inside that we'll call our super function. Now the local strategy doesn't have any configuration for it, and hence we don't have anything inside the super function. But when we go to the JWT strategy, right, I will show you how the super function becomes very important, because there are certain kinds of configurations which typically goes in the super function. Just to give you an example, when we are working with, let's say, Twitter, so there will be certain kinds of things like the consumer key and the consumer secret, which you need to pass to the strategy, right? And that's what is going to happen inside the super function. For now, we don't need to worry about it because local has that. We'll create a validate function. Validate function will expect email, password, and what I'm thinking about is, let's say we will have an auth service which validates the credentials. So I'll do something like constant user equals await. Now I need the auth strategy to be in place. So why don't we inject it like so? We call this auth service. Now we need a function which will validate the user credentials. So why don't we go inside the service and say, we'll have a function called validate user credentials. It will be expecting email, password, and let's first get that out of in here, email, password, like so. And what we are going to say is if we don't get the user while we are validating, then obviously it is an unauthorized exception. So we will just throw that particular exception. What happened? I don't think, yeah, it is kind of complaining because, we haven't returned anything, but what I'm going to do is say either it is going to return a promise of user or undefined. Okay. And it is again it will complain, but at least this file doesn't complain at all. So return user. So it will be either undefined or it will be a user object. Now quickly, we would need a user based on the email. So why don't we do one thing? I'll inject the user service and I'll have a method inside my user service called get user by email, which will give me the user if it exists with that email address. Okay. User service, right? Like that. I think it will now complain. Okay. Maybe I'll for some time stop it and see. Yes. I knew it is going to happen. It is complaining that the auth module dependency is not getting resolved because user service is not available. And that is happening because I think inside user module, yes, I haven't exported the user service. First of all, that's something which I need to do. But even with that, I don't think this is going to stop complaining because even now inside my auth module, right, I need to import the user module. This is a little bit of, I would say it can create confusion. I took a lot of time to understand the dependencies, but yes, eventually, once you start practicing, things will become easy. But the main thing is you need to understand that because everything is a module, whenever you are accessing something from some other module, even if it is a service or something like that, you need to import the module in the current module. So for example, right, we are in the auth module and we are using something from the user module. So we need to import it. Okay. And just importing it will not work if you are importing a service. Typically we will import a service, right? So you need to import the module, user module inside auth. And additionally, you need to ensure that the service is being exported, okay, from the original module. So user module needs to export the user service, and when the auth module imports the user module, it will have access to the user service, which is being exported from user module. That's the kind of the dependency which is getting resolved inside NestJS. If I was able to explain you right, I can understand it can become a little complicated, but yeah, bear with me. Try to practice these things and you will definitely get that. Okay, so inside our auth service, as we said, we need to depend on user service. User service will have a method called getUserByEmail. So let's see, how do we do that? GetUserByEmail. We'll pass the email address as a string and then we'll return the user. Okay, so this is quite straightforward. GetUserByEmail is a service function which takes the email address, which is a string. It makes a call, find one. It will return either a user object or it will return undefined, not unknown. And then over here, what I will do is get user equals this dot user service dot getUserByEmail. Okay, once I get the user, I need to do a basic check. So if I don't find the user, then I'm raising a bad request exception because the user doesn't exist. So whatever you were thinking of didn't work, right? And now there's also one thing, which is we need to confirm that the credential second part, which is the email, is fine, but the password is also correct, right? And how do we do that? We need bcrypt because the bcrypt is being used to hash the password. So what we will do is bcrypt.compare. The first parameter is going to be the actual password, which is in plain text, and it will need to be compared against the user password. And what I'm going to say is if over here, if this doesn't work, okay, if the compare fails, then throw new. This should be on unauthorized exception. And last but not least, if line number 16 and 18 doesn't fail, then we basically have a proper user which the auth service was able to find. So it will pass it to the strategy. So let's quickly look at what happened. Auth controller, local guard. Okay, local guard is the strategy which we have defined. And then we have local strategy here where how do you say, it will call the validate method. You need to understand that. And it will first try to find a user, a valid user based on the validate credentials method. It is relying on the user service to get the user. If we don't find the user, we raise an exception. If the password doesn't match, we raise an exception. If everything is fine, we return the user. And over here, we are returning the user again from the strategy. So with this in place, I think because the app is running, so far so good, let's try and see if this works. Okay, we have an error. This dot validate is not a function. I think what is happening is auth module imports passport module, and let me see if now it makes sense, because I think it was not able to understand what is happening. Validate, is the spelling wrong? Yes, the spelling was wrong and hence it was failing. It looks for that specific function to run. Okay, so you can see we are returning the user object when the password is correct, because if I make a wrong password, oops, that shouldn't have been the case. So what I can understand is that somehow it is not throwing this exception when the password is wrong. So let's look at bcrypt compare. Let me see bcrypt hashing. Okay. So password and hash, this is correct. I wonder what is the reason for it to fail. Let's see. Constant is match equals this console.log. Let us console and see what is happening. Okay, so it's a pending promise, and that's the reason I think it is failing, which means, do I need to do a wait over here? Correct. So that was the mistake that I was doing. I think now it should start working properly if I'm not wrong. Go to this, and it's an unauthorized request, whereas if I do 1 2 3, and now it is passing. So a mistake in my code that was resulting in that bad functionality, but at least now we have our comparison code in place, and we have a local strategy which is authenticating the user credentials, and if the credentials are correct, we are able to return something. That something right now is request.user, where the user object is. Correct? But then ideally what needs to happen is, we have this local auth guard. It is responsible for taking the email and the password, and it validates using the strategy and says whether the user is authenticated or not. But then at that point, I should be able to send back a JWT token instead of this kind of a response, which is here. Because fine, I did log in, but if I have a new route where, like the quiz list or the quiz create, how do I authenticate myself? I need to send the token, right? And that's where the second strategy, which is the JWT strategy, will come into picture, where we will pass a token which we will get after login as a header parameter, and then that header will be validated. So let's get started on that piece. So to start with, let's just try and first generate a token instead of sending back this user object, because this is really not helping us. The idea is that this auth controller route, which is login, will in the end send me a token which has the user object as well as the validity, right? So the JWT token which I can send as header. So let's see how we can do that. To generate the token, I need certain npm modules. So I'll first install them. The first one is the Nest JWT and Passport JWT, because we will be using the Passport JWT strategy and all the things which are available with that. So I'm doing this install, and then I'll need to also install the type definition, which is the types/passport JWT. I think it says there's some error. Nest, okay, that's NestJS. Sorry about that. And now it's time to install the type definitions and hit enter. So while this is happening, okay, that happened quite quickly. I think the npm modules were already there. So it picked up from cache, maybe, I don't know whether npm still does that. So we have our login method, which is returning the request user, but instead I would want it to sign the data and create the JWT token, right? So let's say inside our auth service, we create a function called generate token. It will expect a user payload. Okay, that's typically what is coming from the passport. That's the convention. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return access token, which will be signing the payload using JWT service. So I'll need to inject that JWT service. The interesting thing is, it's not adding the JWT service and I'm wondering why. So I added nest JWT, then it should have picked it up. Nest JWT, right. So what is the problem? Let me see my package JSON. This is a bit weird. Says it is up to date and still it is not able to get it. So maybe I'll manually add it for now. Like this. Okay. And now things will start to break. Okay. First of all, I think there's some problem with the code. And yes, now as you can see, immediately it's complaining about the dependencies. So first thing first, we need to solve this. We'll go to auth module, and in here, I'll need to, again, for some reason, JWT module is not happening. Why don't I reload my window and see? Maybe that will solve the problem. Sometimes that does. Oh yes, it did. So a quick tip, if your imports are not working, see if you can reload your VS Code, and typically that just works. Okay, so I need to register my JWT model. And during the registration of my JWT model, I need to pass a secret. This is the random string which is going to be used while signing the key. And this key is going to be very important. Ideally, for the purpose of this video, I'm keeping this in the code itself, but you should not do this. It should be strong string, not something which is very easy to guess. And it should be coming from your environment variable, and it should not be visible to other users, because if they do, then what is going to happen is they are going to be able to create JWT tokens, which will be validated by your application. And so they can create JWT tokens for any user, because they just need to stick it in the header, right? They don't even need to create the login credentials. They don't need the login credentials. So this has to be very secret. Okay, this is fine. And now I think everything should work. Yes, it does. So inside my auth service provider, what I can now do is this .jwt service.sign. Okay, this is what will be called, and the payload to sign will be name, user.name, and typically in a JWT token, your user ID is declared as sub. Okay, so this is what I'm returning from generate token, and inside my auth controller, why don't I do this oh, I need to import the auth service. So let me quickly do that. Constructor. Something like this. Okay, it's not an async function, so I can skip that. Or is this an async function? Let me see. String payload. No, it returns a string, so I can do string. Type this. Okay, because it's an object, I can keep it as any for now. Still not taking it. Okay, just skip it for now. I'll see what actually needs to happen, but let's go to our Thunder client now and see if we are able to log in. We would be, but the question is, what is the response now? All right, so can you see I have now the access token coming as a response. Initially, it was the request user. So if we do that again, right, you'll see we were sending the request user object, which, as I told you, is of no use because I need something which can be carry forwarded. So that's where our first step is, which is we are generating a JWT token. We have our token in place. I can request for a new token and I'll store it, let's say, inside my SPA. I'll store it in my cookie, and whenever subsequent requests are made, I will send the token. But then how do I validate that token? So for that, we have the passport strategy, which will use the token and validate whether it is correct or not. So let's see how we do that. So we already have, let me first close everything else. Close others. Yeah. So we have local strategy and auth guard. Let's just say, for sake of simplicity, we are creating a get URL where we will get the current authenticated user. So I will create a route called user, and it will return a promise. Okay. Oh yes, I now remember this will be promise any, like so. Okay. Right. So this is a how do you say? This is one URL where we are expecting a request object. Okay. And ideally, we will pass a guard. In our case, it will be an JWT auth guard, which will validate the token and return us the user object. So let's see how we can do that. First of all, I'll create a guard. So in this case, it will be JWT auth dot JWT auth guard. Okay. And in that, it is going to be quite simple. I'll just steal a little bit of this code and say this is JWT. That's about it. Okay. And in here, I'll import JWT auth guard. It is an injectable class, so this can be added over here. But then we still need to tell Nest what is the strategy behind validating that user, right? That's what is the heart of the logic on how the token will be validated. So we will create a new strategy. We'll call it JWT strategy.ts. And in here, like the previous local strategy, right? We'll do export class JWT strategy. Okay. And we will extend the passport strategy. Now I need to tell which strategy I'm going to use. Let's see if we get that. Yes, I'm going to use passport JWT. So that is imported. So quickly to give you a difference, local strategy says it extends passport strategy, which is very similar to the JWT strategy. The only difference is here, the strategy is passport local. Okay, that's how the strategy knows what mechanism of validation to run. Whereas in here, the strategy is coming from passport JWT. So the validate function will accordingly take its logic. Okay. Now in here, as I mentioned, in the local, there was nothing much inside the super function. But in the case of JWT, there are definitely certain things which we need to properly configure. So the first one is secret key. And you need to ensure that this is exactly same as what you have in your auth module. Okay, this secret should match. This is going to be used to validate the signature. And we also need to say that the JWT will be visible from, or rather available from request. So extract JWT from auth header as bearer token. Fine. So this is done, and async, we need the validate function. I'll have payload as this. Return from the payload. Obviously, if you remember what we have when we signed the token was name and sub. So we will get that exactly as is. So payload dot sub and name is payload dot name. This is where maybe you can additionally have some stuff, right? Like, once the validation is done, you can stick in the email address, the role if required. In that way, what is going to happen is your JWT token has very minimum information. You can even skip the name, just keep the ID, right? If it validates, then you pull everything in and then you return something. For example, right, I can say this is tenant Amitav, something like that. Okay, we will see that. But then the thing is, you may think, well, the validate function is just returning an object. So where is the validation happening? Well, in this case, the main validation will happen over here. Okay, that's how things will work. Now, one thing, again, we have a new strategy. So we need to pass that as a provider, JWT strategy. Okay. And let's see, I'll go to my Thunder client, logged in user. I need to copy this token from here. And over here, there are, let's see. Oh, yes, I get it. So as you can see, now if someone tampers with the token, it says unauthorized. Even if, for example, we had that token, right? Inside the strategy, if the thing doesn't match, right? This signature is different from the signature which is here. So what is going to happen? It is still going to complain. Oh, sorry, let me remove them. It is still going to complain that the signature, the token is not valid. Why? Because right now it is using this key and the token was not created using that key. So it will not match. The moment I correct it, as you can see, this data is available. And if you go to the auth controller, this is available to you inside the request as request.user. So that is the beauty of Passport. It automatically adds the user object to your request. And so in your subsequent request lifecycle, you will get that request and it is validating against this guard. So to quickly recap, what have we done so far? I'll give you a sense because a lot of things happened and it would be good to understand what went where. So we created an auth module. Okay, in that auth module, we have a controller. If we go with the understanding of how things are working in a request, right? We have two URLs. One is the login URL. This is where the user sends the username and password to authenticate. When the user passes the username and the password, the local auth guard is being used. Okay, the local auth guard expects username and password, and then the local strategy is applied. Now inside the local strategy, the validate function, when it is called, it gets the email and the password, and I am validating whether the email and password is correct or not. So you can have different kinds of ways to validate it. For example, you can only have phone number and OTP instead of the password, and then you validate against the OTP, right? But the basic idea is that if you find that the pair, which is the email and the password, or maybe the mobile number and the OTP is correct, you, inside your auth service, right, you validate the user. Once the validation is done, we return that. Okay, and that's how auth guard understands that the pair, which in our case can be the email and password or the mobile and the OTP, right, is correct. And then what we do is we get that user object from Passport in our request object. And then the controller, what it does is it takes that request user, it passes it to auth service and generates a token. In here, we don't do too many fancy things. We just return an object which has a key called access token, and there we sign our data, which is name and the user ID, and create a token. Okay, and that is how, if you remember, inside auth login, we create our token. So far, so good. That is where the local auth guard and local strategy comes into picture. But then we now have a authenticated JWT token. In the subsequent request, all the URLs where we need to pass the JWT, we need a new guard. This guard is called the JWT auth guard. Okay, we create this new guard over here, JWT auth guard, right? And inside the controller, we use that guard. Now, we also have a associated strategy for it, the JWT strategy. What does that JWT strategy do? It says that whatever is coming as a token in the header as a bearer token, take it, match it with the key, and see whether it validates or not. If it does, then the validate function will be called and this payload will be returned. So whatever was encrypted or what was signed inside the payload, I won't say it was encrypted, but whatever was signed inside the JWT token was decrypted and it is now available as a user request. So as you can see, this controller returns the request.user object, which has the entire data from the JWT plus if you want to add some additional information, for example, the user's tenant, the user's role, whatever it is, right? Anything which is sensitive and you don't want to put it in your JWT token, you can use that. And last thing, which I want you to understand is JWT is not encrypted. It's a signature, okay? And that is important to know. Why? Because as I told you, you should not be storing something very sensitive inside your JWT token. Why? If you go to this place and if I paste my JWT over here, can you see my name and the subscriber, which is my ID, is available? How is that possible? This is a random token. So as I told you, it is encoded, but it is not encrypted, which means it's not necessary that no one can decrypt it because the information is available. What is holding it true is, where is it? This key, right? I mean, obviously I can tamper with things and get away, but once I put this secret, it says signature verified. And at that point, can you see any tampering with the data will not allow me to validate. That is what is important. So if I remove it, oops, now it is not updating. Anyway, the thing is, as I told you, the signature is important. So store that very carefully. And yes, your JWT token is not a very secure source of truth. So pass only things which you feel are not very important, or you don't want to disclose them. For example, right, if you don't want to disclose the name of the user, right, you should not put it here. Only the user ID should be there. And then, as I told you, once you have validated in this strategy, you can return whatever you want. Okay. So yeah, that's it, guys. That's how in a NestJS application, we can implement the JWT token. Hope you understood everything. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the comments below and I will try to help you as much as possible. If you like this video, do click on the thumbs up icon and don't forget to subscribe to my channel.